Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. As you know, we've been doing these programs on a temporary basis during the lockdown, trying to make sense of the health, medical, legal, and economic consequences, and perhaps even political consequences of COVID-19 and its effects on people, and trying to help all of us who listen to these particular programs to puzzle out what has been this unprecedented situation which we found ourselves in the year 2020. And today, it's a great delight to welcome Moeletsi Mbeki, who has for years been one of the most astute political and economic commentators on the condition in South Africa, and is well placed to help us through some of the dilemmas that we are facing today. So Moeletsi, thank you very much for giving us time to talk to you. And I wondered if I could start off by asking you, I mean, quite bluntly, how big a hole are we in? I mean, do you see light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, what with an 8% GDP decline and obviously still a continuing health crisis, amongst other things. I suppose people listening to this program would be wondering what hope there is.
Well, we are in a big hole, Dennis, and the thing is that we have been in a big hole for such a long time that we tend to think it's normal. When I had an interview a few days ago with a journalist from South Africa is at somewhere around 30%, because in Western Europe, that's unthinkable unless there is a very big crisis. You had something like unemployment going to 25% in Spain and Greece about 2 or 3 years ago. But that was seen as a major crisis, and everybody in Western Europe, in the European Union, had to come in to try and solve that problem. And unemployment has indeed declined very steeply in those countries. In South Africa, unemployment has been growing since around about 2009, and we don't seem to think that it is a problem. I did some work in 2014 with the then statistician general, looking at the social structure of South Africa, looking at how our society is structured. And one of the categories he came up with was a category of what he called unemployed and informal sector people. And in that category, there were 49% of the working age population of South Africa. So South Africa, we are, if you think that way, 50% of our population is totally marginalized. It's excluded from economic activity. It is sustained by the other 50% that works. Which means that the standard of living, even of the 50% that works, can never go very high up because they have to finance the other half. That is it. So that's how deep in a hole that we are as a country. And in order to finance the people who are not producing, we are progressively having to borrow money. So we have to borrow money to finance that. So we are really in a very deep hole. It's estimated, I saw there was an article in Business Day today, where they estimate that by some end of this year, our debt, the national debt, will be equal to 100% of GDP. So we're in deep trouble.
And so let me ask you firstly, you say, rightly, I mean, no question, I don't think anybody can dispute this, that this was not just a product of COVID-19. We entered COVID-19 in a very parlous situation, in the economic situation in the first place. I accept that. Why were we, I mean, what is it that has taken us, I mean, I suppose what I'm really trying to ask is, if it's not COVID-19, which it can't be in totality, obviously that's exacerbated the situation. What are the essential causes, in your view, for us having entered COVID-19 in this disastrous situation and therefore coming out in even worse position?
Yes, we were in a hole already anyway. COVID-19 has just dug it a bit deeper. Well, the fundamental problem in South Africa is actually historic, but in the short term, the problem in South Africa is we divert our resources to consumption instead of to investment. That is the fundamentals of our problem. If you look at South Africa, if you look at our gross domestic product, something like over 60% of our gross domestic product goes to consumption. In China, it's only 35% of gross domestic product that goes to consumption. 45% goes to investment. And that's why China has been able to grow the economy and to employ more people and to absorb. China is having a huge population moving from the countryside to the cities to work, not like in South Africa, where we're having people moving from the countryside to the cities, but not to work because there is no work for them. So that is the fundamental problem. But of course, like all problems in a society, they have their historic context. So maybe we can go into that if we have time.
We will go into that, but let me put this to you. I suppose people on the other side will say, well, maybe you're right, but China can do that because it's not a democracy. It's an authoritarian regime. It can order people around. It can repress people, and it does do that. Here we've got a democracy, and therefore the trade unions, etc., can shout the odds, and we have to respond to that. Hence, high wage increases and so on and so forth. Much more difficult to kind of develop an economic policy of the kind that you're talking about. How do you respond to that?
Well, that is definitely not true, because you have democracies in Asia like South Korea, like India. But India, their investment is somewhere close to 30%. So you can have investment in a democracy. The key issue is the environment that you create that encourages people to invest. It's not the bullying. Many people don't understand that actually there's very little repression in China of workers as workers. There may be disagreements about freedom of speech, about all those other things, but the repression of workers in China is actually not like that. It's not like what it was under apartheid in South Africa, for example.
Okay, that's true, although I suppose there's a serious amount of, I'm sure people in Hong Kong wouldn't entirely agree with you, but that's...
Yes, that's a different issue.
Yeah, I know it's a different issue, but let me ask you this then. I mean, is the fundamental... you are not... doesn't make a bad point, it's a very good point, but I mean, people have pointed out that, few people, I must admit, that we should be shifting from consumption to capital expenditure, and without that, you're never going to grow. Is that a cause of the fact that we've adopted incorrect economic policy, or are these political reasons which lie at the heart of this inability to shift the nature of our expenditure?
Well, you know, economic reasons are actually expressions of political power, distribution of political power. That's what they're all about. If you have no political power, then you get less and less of the benefits of any society. If you have more political power, you get more and more benefits of it, or from that society. So at the end of the day, we have this distribution of political power in South Africa, which favor the top, let's say 10 or 12% of the population. And then they structure the economy in a way that benefits them, rather than in a way that benefits the other 90% or 88% who have less political power. So that's the crux of our problem.
But people like, people who supported the previous president, including himself, would have argued that what we've got is white monopoly capital that has continued to essentially perpetuate this particular problem. On the counter to that is, but we've been having a majority government for 25 years. So where does the truth lie?
Well, the truth lies in the second part. The white monopoly capital does not have political power. So it's the people who control political power who perpetuate and entrench the distribution of wealth that we're sitting with. And the people who do that are the guys who are in parliament and the people who control political power. It's not the industrialists, black or white. They are ordinary citizens. They have one vote like everyone else. But it's the people who control political power who determine how the cake, so to speak, is to be sliced up. And they choose a big part of the slice for themselves. Just to give you an illustration, last year the Minister of Finance pointed out that there are over 29,000 civil servants and politicians who earn more than R1 million a year each. So now, if you compare, that is a huge amount of resources that is being transferred from the taxpayer, from the producer, and being transferred to the people who control political power, which are the civil servants and the politicians and the elites in the public sector. So so it's them who make the decisions at the end of the day. It's not, it was under the National Party, it was different. Under the National Party was a party of property owners. They own farms. Some of them started to become industrialists. So they were. So one could say then that political power did indeed rest with white monopoly capital, which included the National Party. But you can't say so under the ANC government. The ANC government, it controls political power, although it does not own property, so to speak.
I'm going to come back to the implications of that at the moment, but you know, on these programs, I've interviewed a whole range of people from different views, and it's a pity they aren't on the program so we can debate this all together. But there have been, for example, economists who I suspect would regard themselves as progressive and not necessarily, and in fact critical of the government's economic policy, who still say, okay, we may be putting perhaps, we may be putting a bit too much money in some of the public service sector, but if you curb consumption expenditure, because of the multiplier effect, that kind of economic policy puts you into a decline. And therefore, it is naive to believe that we shouldn't be spending, that we should be spending more. And I haven't heard them talk necessarily about capital expenditure. What I think they're talking about are a whole range of expenditures to alleviate poverty for poor people.
Well, the business community recently produced a document about where the South African economy should be going. And a huge part of that document emphasizes the importance of investment. Because the thing is that the half of our population that's unemployed is not producing anything. So for it to spend, you have to transfer from those who are producing. So you are not creating a multiplier environment because they are not producing. When you invest, the people who are unemployed become productive. So they now add value, and therefore you are then expanding the market. So that is essentially the equation. So the business community itself, in their recent document, I think it's called Inclusive Economic Development, they are very strong about removing obstacles to investment, about investing in infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And they identify the problems that, especially the regulatory problems that are in the way of investment.
Well, when I interviewed Michael Parr, who's the strategist for 91, he put a lot of blame on the fact that South African economists have a total poverty of imagination. He's in total agreement with you that we have to go for a shift away from consumption expenditure. I think he and you are utterly at him about that. But what he was saying, that our economists need to stop going to America and England and Europe and look at places like South Korea and Ethiopia and even some of the South American countries, in order to kind of, as it were, develop new and fresh thinking as to how you would have the kind of infrastructural and capital expenditure which is suitable for a country of our size and our developmental status. In short, what he was saying was there's an utter poverty of imagination amongst economists to develop policies that actually are going to do anything for us.
No, but you see, he's advising the wrong person. He should be giving his advice to the politicians.
Yeah, but I'm not sure they listen.
Well, he has to make them listen.
No. But I think his point is, Moeletsi, his point is that you scratch around with a level of despair if you look around the country to see where in the public domain imaginative economic thinking, which is suitable for us, actually takes place. That's the point he's making.
Yes, I don't really think it's correct to say that the economists or the intellectuals in South Africa are deficient relative to other intellectuals in other parts of the world. The real challenge that they have, the intellectuals are faced with, is that the politicians don't listen to them. In other parts of the world, they do listen to them. So that is the challenge, is how do we begin to set up an environment where there's real conversation between the thinkers, the philosophers, the industrialists, the government, the politicians, and so on, so that we then come up with solutions to South Africa's problems.
But we've had, I mean, let me ask you this, we've had, and it's common cause, an incredible amount of different policy think tanks, international economists, I mean, seriously international economists, Mary Mazzucato, Danny Roderick, people like that, Joseph Stiglitz. There have been all sorts of unbelievably distinguished economists, and they've come up with various reports and more reports. And notwithstanding all the reports and all the intellectual work that they do, as they say, you know, talk is cheap, money buys the whiskey. I mean, nobody's buying the whiskey.
No, we the taxpayer are buying whiskey for the politicians.
Okay.
Reality, I agree with you. These people have come up with very good ideas of what South Africa should be doing. But you know, one of the things, Dennis, which we have forgotten is that political power is about interests. People don't become ministers just because they want a job and they want a title. They become ministers and politicians to represent interests. Now, these interests are set up in the society in general. What the problem these great economists and advisors that we have domestically as well as internationally is that at the end of the day, they are faced with the interests that the ruling party represents and the ruling party is not moving from the interest which it represents. And the interest that it represents, to simplify, the priority interest of the ruling party is to advance the consumption of the African people first and foremost, so that they equal to the consumption of the whites. But of course, in reality, that means advancing the consumption of the African middle class to be equal to the consumption of the white middle class. So that is the fundamental interest that the ruling party has to advance. Now, if you can persuade them that, look, can we postpone this for another 5 years or 10 years? Let's focus on building up the production capacity of South Africa. Let's bring more people in the economy. We will have a smaller black middle class with a lower standard of living, but we build up a productive capacity, which is what happened in Asia. If you look at countries like South Korea, I'm not even talking about the communist countries. If you look at South Korea, if you look at Japan, if you look at the salary payments of the upper class, of the professionals and the senior management, they're much, much lower than in South Africa. The South African public service, to come back to that, the OECD, the Developed Countries Organization, did an evaluation a couple of years ago, I think it was, where they said the South African public service is the most expensive in the world, in the sense that a huge part of our gross domestic product goes to paying the salaries of the public service. I think the number was 14% of GDP. Similar countries to South Africa at a similar standard of development is only half of that, is 6 or 7%. So those are political decisions. They are not economic decisions. So we have to persuade the ruling party to postpone this consumption by the black middle, equating the consumption of the black middle class to that of the whites, and focus instead on developing and employ and creating employment and getting entrepreneurs to create employment for the population that is unemployed. And in another 5 or 10 years.
I take the point. There's a particular question I want to ask, and then there's a more general one. The general one, I think, is the more important one. But the particular one is this. Maybe it's also important. That I agree. I'm interviewing you, but I would agree, because otherwise, what's the point? That yes, there's a huge public service wage bill which is unsustainable, but the public sector is not a monolithic institution. I mean, the policemen and the teachers and the doctors and the nurses, particularly as a result of COVID, need to be paid properly if we're going to have decent services.
I agree completely, but as the Minister of Finance pointed out, the doctors and the policemen and the teachers, they are probably 1.1 million people. But the guys who are being paid millions are the 29,000.
Yeah, that's now accept. There's, one cannot debate that point with you. So my second question then, and of course, something should radically happen with them, and obviously other members of the public service sector who are not necessarily as critical as the ones I've been speaking about. I accept that. So let me then put this to you. You talk about the black middle class having, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I understood being that they need to be sort of realistically modest in the short term, because if they are, and we can then turbocharge the economy, they will get their fruits at the end of the day, because once you start growing at 4, 5, 6%, all sorts of things happen. But how do you then square up the black middle class saying, well, that's all very well, Moeletsi, but you're leaving intact a whole bunch of white middle class who are totally privileged by, and I don't need to tell you this given your history, by apartheid. I mean, isn't that a problem that we've got in our country a sort of island of extraordinary privilege, which was accrued to a large degree because of the racism of 300 years?
Okay, can I give you an example
Of course.
of real white privilege?
Yeah.
And it's not South Africa, it's England. Then I'll come back to the white middle class in South Africa.
Yeah.
The richest landowner in England is a man called the Duke of Westminster. Now, the Duke of Westminster was one of the commanders of William the Conqueror's army in 1066 when the French, the Normans, conquered England. So his ancestor was assigned to conquer Wales. And in return for subduing the Welsh, he was given huge tract of land in Wales. And then he married the daughter of another general who was called Grosvenor, another Norman general. This guy had been also a commander, and he was sent to conquer where London is now. So he owned the land. So these two families merged together their assets, and they are now under the name of the Duke of Westminster. Now, they own all of Oxford Street. Now, you can't get a better real estate than that. Now, they have been owning this land since 1066. And most of the land in England is owned by these white monopoly capitalists, if I can call them that, who own the land. In fact, even they angered the Americans recently because the Americans had an embassy in next to Oxford Street in a place called Grosvenor Square, named after these conquerors, and they wanted to buy the land on which the embassy stood, and the Duke of Westminster said, "Sorry, no, I'm not selling. You have to keep paying rent in perpetuity, lease for me." So the Americans went somewhere else where I guess they could buy land and left them. So that is how history works in the real world. Now, the white middle class in South Africa. Most of the white middle class in South Africa is no longer operating in the state, is no longer employed by the state. Most of the white middle class is in the private sector. And they generate their own income, whichever way they generate their own income. As a policymaker, it's very difficult to say to them, make a sacrifice, because they will just laugh at you and say, why should I? I own the property that I have, it's my asset, I pay myself, why should you dictate to me how much I should pay myself? I own, for argument's sake, I own Woolworths. Why should I not pay myself R1 million dividend from owning Woolworths? You as the government. So this is the reality we're sitting with. The black middle class has to make the sacrifice because now they depend on the state. Most of them depend. And those who feel that they want to be like the white middle class, then they must go to the private sector and make their own businesses, and then they can pay themselves whatever they want to pay themselves. But those who are dependent on the taxpayer, then the priority, they have to realize the priority is to bring more of the people into production. And in order to do that, they have to make the sacrifices. I'm afraid they have to make those sacrifices so that everybody's employed. And then 5 years from now, of course their incomes will grow up, so will become bigger and bigger. Yeah.
I'd love to debate this with you further, but I'm running out of time and I want to ask you a couple of further questions. So let's go with your analysis, which, you know, I'm not sure whether I need to slit my wrists now in despair or what, but if you were the president of South Africa now, right, what would be the 2 or 3 things that you would do, given your analysis? Because that'll give us some yardstick to know whether those things are possible and why they're not happening.
Well, as I say, the first thing I would do is I have to look at how do I persuade my fellow black middle class to accept, to sacrifice. That would be is how do I persuade them to sacrifice? And of course I have to persuade them that this sacrifice is not in perpetuity. It will be a 10-year or 15-year program, but for them to be able to accept that sacrifice, I will have to bring the public education sector and the public healthcare sector to the same standards as where the private sector and the private education, private health are standing. Because then they will retain the same life expectancy as the white middle class, if you wish, but this will be a social wage, so to speak. So I'm not going to be. So this is one of the huge problems we have in South Africa. Is that we put the new black middle class, in order to get the standard of living of the whites, they have to get the private education. They have to have private healthcare. But they are civil servants. They are not industrialists. They are not business people. So these are the big challenges you have to do. So if you straighten up our public education system and our public health system, our public transport system, now straightening up those kinds of systems and bringing up their quality to become world class actually creates jobs itself. But the way in which the government is thinking, because they think in redistributive terms, they think, oh, we must take from the whites and give to the blacks. Now that formula doesn't work because the whites are not as rich as they look. When they're a small part of the population. They are not. If you redistribute the income that they earn, it's nothing next to the 90% of the black population that you have to address.
I hear you, and it's obviously true that if the social wage is targeted, that it delivers the healthcare and it delivers the education, and people can build up an intellectual capital. Young black children who at the moment are being denied that because of the terrible education they get, stands to reason that, you know, over a period that indeed will happen, as you suggest. One of the things that because now I'm really short of time, one final question. The one thing that's been omitted from our complete conversation, although maybe you're mentioning it indirectly, is corruption. And I suspect you mentioned it because you're talking about rent seeking in some way. But I mean, do you see any hope for the fact that could be curbed?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I think there is a huge exaggeration about corruption relative to the many other challenges that South Africa is faced with. Partly because it's a sexy topic for journalists and for the media, so it's seen out of context. the reality is that one of the problems of the corruption is precisely because our public services like the education, the health, the transport, forces people forces the blacks in the public sector, the black manager, middle management and upper management class to try and aspire to be like the whites in the private sector. Now, it's not workable. So what do? They then try to get a higher income from the public sector, higher than they are entitled to by the laws and the rules of the country. That's really what is the driver of this corruption. If we sorted out the social wage, the social services, and all those things, then the middle class, the new black middle class employed in the public sector, they don't have to send their children to these ultra expensive schools like St. John's, like Hilton. Those who can afford, who are in the private sector, well, let them send their children to St. John's and to Hilton. But create the public education sector must be affordable so that the people, the new middle class who have no accumulated wealth, are able to send their children, and those children get an education that's as good as what St. John's will give them. Then
I accept that. But just let me ask you one final question. I mean, you know, reports about the monies that people like the Guptas got out of the country could be as high as 200, 300 billion. I mean, that's not small fry. That's not.
Oh, yeah. Yes, but that was a very, very special. You see, South Africans are vulnerable, especially the ANC government. They're very naive. They're newcomers to power in the world. So they're very gullible. they get taken for a ride by all sorts of players in the global system. So the Gupta brothers saw these novices who were running this very rich country, and they swindled them. And they are not the only ones, I'm sure. There are plenty. We have plenty of our own rich people who are swindling South Africa and taking money out of the country or not paying their taxes or whatever. So it's one of the problems you have when you have a new government that's run by inexperienced people. It's a part of our learning, in a way, a learning curve.
Moeletsi, thank you very much. I've run out of time. Thank you for being so generous with your time. And I'm quite sure this particular conversation will be one that will get people debating, as always is the case when you make a contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis.